I'm sorry that my voicemail message is ringing. Michelle? Okay. Sorry, everybody. Thank you for your patience. So, just by way of an announcement, next Tuesday night is going to be the last Shiur for the break in the summer. That'll be the end of June. And when July starts, I know everybody's schedules, but mine changes a little bit. So we're going to be taking a break and resuming Yetz Hashem towards at the end. And I'll let everybody know. There'll be announcements as when we're picking up. Usually it's after Yom Tov. I'm not 100% sure, but we're going to see. But in the meantime, we have two exciting, really jam-packed parshas that we're going to learn about. So tonight's parsha is Beha'alotcha. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. There's a lot of Torah. Oh my goodness, this is one of those parshas that I've said. It's not about what to say, it's about what not to say, because there's so much. So here's the very beginning of Parshat Beha'alotcha. V'deber Hashem el Moshe lemor, Hashem speaks to Moshe, saying, Deber la'Aaron ve'amarta ilav. Speak to Aaron and say to him, Ve'ha'alotcha et hanerot el mul pnei hamenorah, ya'iru shivat hanerot. When you kindle the lamps, the menorah, the word in English, lamps, is referring to the menorah. Toward the face of the menorah shall the 7 lamps cast light. So just keep in your mind some image of a menorah. It has 7 candelabra parts and a base. There's a middle part, and 3 to one side, and 3 to the other. So I know that in our common language, the whole piece is called a menorah. But Sforno says that if you listen again, read this carefully, it says following, Aaron, when you light the candles, el mul pnei ha-menorah, that the candles on the menorah should be facing the menorah. Well, that doesn't make sense. The candles are the menorah. So how can the menorah be facing the menorah? So the Sforno says that the center candle, so there's 3, a center and 3, the center candle is called the menorah. So while we may loosely refer to the entire candelabrum, the whole thing is a menorah, Sforno says based on this pasuk, you have 3 candles, and somehow they're supposed to be facing something called a menorah. But it can't be that it's the general candelabrum, because you can't have the general candelabrum facing the general candelabrum. That would make sense. So he comes to the conclusion that the centerpiece must have a name on its own, which may be the menorah. So it may be the whole thing gets its name from the centerpiece. But we then have to figure out a whole bunch of things. So what does it mean? Like the symbolism behind it. And nothing in the Torah, as you said, is random. But not only is the content of the pasuk not random, we've spoken so many times before that even the method in which the Torah is recorded is in itself a message. And one of the tools for rabbinic interpretation is called smichut parshiot. Smichut parshiot means that when topics are juxtaposed one to the other, that too is a source of learning. Sometimes the smichut parshiot, the juxtaposition, comes within what we call a general parsha. So in Beha'alotcha, for example, we might determine and discover that certain subtopics in the whole parsha were deliberately put next to each other because there's a message that we should learn from the juxtaposition. But smichut parshiot doesn't only refer to what are the topics under the general category of the name of the parsha. It could also be between parshiyot, parshas in the Torah. So, for example, and this is how Rashi begins his commentary to Parashat Beha'alotcha. He says, in the previous parsha we read last Shabbat called Parshat Naso, the parsha ended with a very, very long and extensive Torah reading, which described the korban, the sacrifice, that each of the 12 Nesi'im brought on the day in which the Mishkan was inaugurated. So it might seem a little bit unusual to keep in mind that the order in which the Torah was recorded sometimes seems like it's non-chronological. So this, I'm just going to mute so we have less interruptions. Okay, and we can unmute at the end of this year. So just keeping in mind that we'll just go quickly. Again, we remember the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu went up on Shavuot, we just celebrated, and he came down 40 days later, which was on the 17th day of Tammuz, Elul Zahav. God got really angry, and so Moshe went up 2 more times, and he got another set of luchot. And this 3rd time that he came down, when God said, okay, I forgive you, and I'm not going to destroy the Jewish people, that was the 10th day of Tishrei, which was Yom Kippur. That's why Yom Kippur is called Yom HaSlicha, the day of forgiveness, because historically it was the day in which the Jewish people were forgiven for the Chet HaEgel. Perfect. The next day after Yom Kippur, which is now the 11th day of Tishrei, Hashem began the commandments of how to build the Mishkan. So in terms of the Parshas that we remember, we go all the way back to Sefer Shmot, we go back to Parsha Teruma, Tetzaveh, Kitisa, Vayakel, Pekudei, all of which deal with various parts of the construction of the Mishkan. Sefer Shmot concludes with the completion of the construction of the Mishkan. But the Mishkan was completed in Kislev. But Hashem deliberately waited for the inauguration, and he said, I'm not doing it in Kislev. He waited till the following Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So they left Egypt in the 15th day of Nisan, and it was on Rosh Chodesh Nisan the following year that Hashem said, okay, we are now going to inaugurate the Mishkan. It was a day of great simcha. And one of the things that happened on the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan is that every Nasi, every prince, every head of each of the Shvatim brought a korban. That particular ritual that happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, is the end of Parshat Naso. So we're already in Sefer Bamidbar, so we have to somehow just reorient ourselves. That we're now talking about something that happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the 2nd year after they left Mitzrayim. So Rashi's first question. The end of Parshat Naso is the description, a very lengthy description of all the Nasim's Korbanot that they brought on the day in which the Mishkan was inaugurated. This week's Parsha talks about the lighting of the menorah. Coincidence? Is there a reason for the juxtaposition? Smichut Parshiot, and said, Rashi says, absolutely. Rashi's not making this up. Rashi is quoting a Midrash. And the Midrash says there was a very deliberate reason why this was done. So I'm going to quote the Midrash in its original. Rashi, one of the great skills of Rashi was that he often edited the Midrashim to take out the points that he felt were pertinent to understanding the plain meaning of the text. Very often Midrashim had a lot of other information, which Rashi said is wonderful, it's fascinating, it's interesting, but it's not pertinent to understanding the plain meaning of this verse. It may have other important ideas, but not to explain the verse, because Rashi always wants to bring it back to this pasuk. So I'm going to read you the entire Midrash, because this entire Midrash, I think, has something fascinating to suggest to us. So, Lama nismacha Parshat HaMenorah Parshat HaNisim. Why is the beginning of Parshat Behalotha, which is the mitzvah that Aaron and Kohanim subsequent to Aaron have to light the menorah every day? Why does that mitzvah follow directly following the detailed description of Korbanot? Lafi kishera'a Aaron Chanukat HaNisim chashad da'ato shelo haya imahem b'Chanukah lo hu v'lo shifto. So Aaron was a bystander. Of course, he came from Shevet too. He came from Shevet Levi. But when you take a look at the end of Parshat Naso, you'll notice that nobody from Shevet Levi brought any korbanot with the other Nisi'im. And so Aaron was feeling left out, that they had this great opportunity to participate in this amazing simcha on the day in which the Mishkan was erected. You can imagine just how great a day it was. And yes, he had a role to play, but he wanted to play more roles, because the more roles, the more simcha, the more opportunity to rejoice in something historical, in something extraordinary. And so Khalshad Atol, he felt weakened. He felt that something was off, that he was missing. He was missing out on this, and this made him so upset. Not for ego, but I wanted to participate in something that brought glory to Hashem. It was a Kiddush Shemayim. And he felt badly that he wasn't given the opportunity, because Shevet Levi didn't bring these korbanot. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but Hashem, knowing that Aaron was feeling this way, says to him, I'm promising you something. I'm making you an oath, Hashem says to Aaron, I'm promising you. Shelcha gadol mishalahem. I'm saying, Aaron, I know what you're looking at right now. Seems like they're getting something you're not getting, and you're thinking that you're losing out. You think that somehow your role is diminished because their role is so great, as the Torah says. Hashem says to Aaron, you're wrong. What you're going to get to do is greater than them. Why? Shakorbanot, kol zman shebeit hamikdash kayam, ein noagim, v'lo yoter. He says because the notion of bringing korbanot can only happen at the time of the time of the Beit HaMikdash. That's all. You can only do that when Beit HaMikdash is around. Beit HaMikdash is not there in the korbanot, which was the role that the Nisi'im played. Well, then that role also comes to an end. But they wrote le'olam, and here's where the Midrash ends. But the candles will burn forever. So the implication in the Midrash is korbanot are going to be short-lived. Korbanot are going to be inextricably tied to the existence of the Beit HaMikdash. But the Neirot, not. That's the end of the Midrash. So we're clever. So I'm sure that most of us are thinking, wait a second. Why is that true? If the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, as it was twice, then that would also cause the menorah not to be lit. So wherein is Hashem giving Aharon any sort of consolation? Oh, your role is greater than theirs. Why? Because their role is going to be short-lived. It's going to be temporal. Your role in lighting the menorah, which is the beginning of Balotcha, that's going to go on and on and on. No, it's not. It's not going to go on and on and on. So it's a question. Now, the Ramban understands this, and he tries to answer. This is what the Ramban, Rav Moshe ben Nachman, says. He says the following, Ze chozer al hadlakat ner Chanukah. The Ramban says, no, what Hashem is promising Aharon is that in the future, it will be the sons of Aharon who are going to rededicate the temple in the time of the Chashmonaim. This is taking us to the 2nd century BCE, around the year 165 BCE, when after the whole story of Hanukkah, we know the story, we read it every year, we say it in benching, Al Anisim, in Amidah. And what do we say? We say that they cleaned out the Beit HaMikdash and they relit the menorah. And who did that? The Chashmonaim, who, as you know, were Kohanim. That's Shevet Levi. So Hashem is making Aaron feel better by saying, listen, you guys, your Shevet is going to be rededicating the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, but that too is going to come to an end. So wherein lies the long-term consolation to Aaron and his children and his descendants, who technically today in the year 2024, they're not lighting any menorahs. So really, Aaron is not wrong. They got to do the korbanot. He's feeling upset. Hashem makes him feel better because they have a handle in the lighting of the menorah. Does it really feel better? So I want to read you a fascinating perspective, which is very clever. So when you think about the menorah, of course, you're thinking about an actual item, an object, an icon, things that lit. But as we talk about over and over and over again, these things have symbolism. What did the menorah symbolize? The menorah symbolized the light of Torah and the wisdom that comes from Torah. So, ner mitzvah v'Torah or. Ner mitzvah v'Torah or. So we have inextricably connect the notion of light and the notion of Torah, Torah or. And so the menorah, while it is a symbol in the Beit HaMikdash, becomes a symbol of Torah. And here's the thing. If the menorah is a symbol of Torah, even if the menorah is gone, Torah is not gone. And so I don't need the menorah, as it were, to continue to burn in order for the meaning of Torah to continue to exist. So here's a fascinating thing. If I were to ask all of you, how many different books are there in the Torah, not the Tanakh, in the Torah? I'm sure instinctively everyone is going to say what we've been learning since we were little children. 5. Breshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim. 5. In fact, in Hebrew, each one of those books is called a Chumash. And Chumash comes from the Hebrew word Kamesh. So even the name Chumash is connected to 5. But the Gemara says something absolutely astounding, and it's based on this week's Parsha. It'll come a little bit later. The Gemara says, well, actually, that may not be entirely accurate. It's not accurate. 5 books in the Torah. Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Vayikra, Vayikra. No, the Gemara says there's actually 7. 7 books to the Torah. 7. I mean, there's 2 books that we've never been told about. They're being hidden somewhere. It says no, they're all there. But we just divided the Torah incorrectly. There's Bereshit 1, Shemot 2, Vayikra 3. Bamidbar is divided into 3 separate books. What? Yes. The Midbar is divided into 3 separate books. The first part starts at the beginning of the Midbar and goes all the way to a section in Parsha Behalotecha that actually is a completely different part of the book. And I'm talking about Perek Yud, 2 psukim, that's all I'm talking about. Lamed Hey and Lamed Vav. And if you look in your Chumash, you'll notice that these 2 psukim are bracketed by 2 nuns, which are inverted and upside down. What? Yes. Now, these psukim are not unknown to you or me, because actually we sing them on a regular basis. Even so, Aaron v'Yomer Moshe, Kuma Hashem v'yafutz lo'edecha, v'yanusu misenecha mipanecha, u'noko yomar shuva Hashem rivot ofei Yisrael. When the ark would journey, Moshe would say, "Arise, Hashem, and let your foes' enemies be scattered. Let those who hate you flee from before you." And when it rested, Moshe would say, "Reside tranquility, O Hashem, among the myriad thousands of Israel." Okay. According to the Gemara, these 2 psukim are a separate book unto itself. So the part from the beginning of Bamidbar to these 2 psukim is a book. These 2 psukim is another book. And from the end of this pasuk to the end of Sefer Bamidbar is another book. So Sefer Bamidbar now is divided into 3. So that would mean, following this opinion of the Gemara, that there are 7 books to the Torah. Now, why is that significant in understanding this midrash? Significant because how many branches are there on the candelabrum? There's 7. So now I understand why the menorah may be a symbol of all of Torah. Because if Torah is in fact divided into 7 books, as this opinion states, and the menorah has 7 branches, then it represents the fullness, the completion, the wholeness of the Sefer Torah. So when Hashem turns to Aaron and says, "Aaron, I know now on the day in which the Mishkan was established, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, you're upset. I know you're upset, and you're a little bit envious that you don't have a role to play in these korbanot. But I'm telling you that your role is greater." Why is your role greater? Not because you will be constantly lighting this specific item called the menorah, because just like the korbanot would have come to an end with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, lo aleinu, so too will the lighting of the menorah come to an end with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, lo aleinu, fortunately. But not Torah. You, Aaron, and your descendants will continue to teach Torah to the Jewish people, whether there is a Beit HaMikdash or whether there isn't a Beit HaMikdash. Yes, we want it, but if it's not there, Torah has not come to an end. It will continue. Torah HaKdusha HaMerumezet B'Shivat Kinei HaMenorah Hi Mechaperet B'Chol Zman La'olam. Torah can't end because just like there were 7 branches on the menorah, and that menorah refers to the 7 books in the Torah, according to this opinion, Torah will be eternal and will always be a tool for reaching and helping us achieve atonement. So that's the opening part about Behalotecha. We're going to come back to that little story, or not story, about the idea about the 7 books of the Torah in a little bit when we get to chapter 10. Okay, but I do want to spend a little bit more time on this first pasuk and share a really fascinating idea with you that I hope you're going to enjoy as much as I did. So, Parsha, as we know, begins with a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah for Aharon and other Kohanim following him to light the candles. Now, let's just look at the word one more time. If I were to ask you on simple Hebrew today, how do you say the word to light? Well, those of you women or men perhaps who are lighting Shabbos or Yom Tov candles would say, well, in the bracha it's lahadlik ner shel Yom Tov, lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. So the word for lighting a candle as part of a mitzvah is lahavlik. But that's not the word. The Torah says behalotecha, when you raise or when you elevate. So that's an unusual choice of words. And that, again, is always a red flag. It's a signal. And the Chachamim know that there's a more common, more regular word to use to describe an idea or to fill in something in the Torah. And the Torah goes out of its way to use an irregular word that probably shouldn't be used for the elegance of the language. You know that there's a different reason why the Torah is using that word. So Rashi right away begins to say, well, wait a second, doesn't say lahavlik. And so Rashi gives us two ideas of what ve'ha'alotecha refers to. The word itself comes leha'alot, to raise, to elevate. So there's got to be some meaning to this idea of lighting the menorah. It's about elevation. And so Rashi tells two possibilities. One is that that's the goal of lighting, which is to elevate the flame, to make the flame go up. You light the candle, you light the wick, and the flame is supposed to go up. And so it becomes in some ways a metaphor for what Aaron is trying to do, what parents are trying to do, what teachers are trying to do, which is to create that flame so it goes on by itself. The purpose of lighting a candle is not to stay there with the little lamp, the flame with the match so it keeps going. You want to light the wick so that it burns by itself, which is exactly what we want to do to our children, want to do for our students, what we want to do for Jews around the world. We want to ignite their internal flame so it goes up on its own. And that's why beha'alotecha was used as a way of talking about not the act of lighting a candle, but the meaning behind it, to create that fire, to create that independent flame that yearns to go up. That's explanation number one that is centered on why beha'alotecha. But Rashi gives us another explanation, which is, in his mind, equally important. Rashi gives you two explanations. You need to know from a methodological perspective, Rashi will always give you two explanations when he feels that both are necessary to understand the fullness of the verse. There probably are multiple ideas that Rashi refused to include that are in a midrash somewhere, and there are many midrashim, but he said that's not the meaning of the verse. I'm only going to give what I believe is the plain meaning of the verse. So he thinks this verse is more nuanced, and he gives you two answers. So what's the second answer? So Rashi tells us, based on the Mishnah and the Second Tamid and elsewhere, that in the actual Beit Mishkan and later on in the Beit HaMikdash, there was a little stairway, 3 steps, that were put in front of the menorah. 3 steps. Now, the menorah itself, has anybody been to Israel and somewhere in the old city, or maybe you've been to Machon HaMikdash, they have that model of the menorah, gold menorah, it's usually in a case. I don't know if anybody knows what I'm talking about. But that menorah was built by this institute for Machon HaMikdash. It's an institute that studies of the Beit HaMikdash and has sought to reconstruct some of the vessels inside the Mikdash according to the measurements in the Chumash. But if you take a look at the measurements of the Mishkan, you'll see that it's not a huge, it's not like those big Chabad Lubavitch Hanukkah menorahs that they have on the street corners that you need one of those big cherry picker trucks to reach to the top. It's not that. That a Kohen actually could stand in front of it and probably reach the candles on his own by just raising his hands. But having said that, the Torah, Rashi is telling us that's not the way it was done. That even though it is possible for a Kohen on his own to light the menorah, there were 3 steps. And so when you go up on steps, I'll say that again, when you go up on steps, that's what Beha'alotcha et hanevot refers to. That the Kohen needs to elevate himself. That the act of lighting the candles requires the Kohen to raise himself up by ascending on these 3 steps, which, again, become themselves symbolic because you don't really need the steps. It's not just a practical utilitarian reason, as I said, because you could light it without. It must have some deeper symbolic meaning, which I just want to read you an idea that it makes sense. So what's the message of having a Kohen necessarily have to climb up on 3 steps? And that's the message. The message is, it's not enough for you to light the candles. I'm doing the mitzvah. Okay, the lighting of the candles is the mitzvah. Shkoyach, I'm a great guy. I did the mitzvah. But by having 3 steps, the message to the Kohen, which is really not just to the Kohen in the Beit HaMikdash. There is no Beit HaMikdash. There is no more Mishkan. So technically, these verses, the beginning of the beginning of Parsha, you could say, well, I'm not. First of all, I'm not a Kohen, and so it'll never apply to me. Or you can say there's no Beit HaMikdash. Even if I'm a Kohen, it still doesn't apply to me. But I hope that over the time that we studied Torah together, you know that's not my approach. My approach is this pasuk, even to the non-Kohanim, is talking about us. So I got to find myself in this pasuk. So when I'm reading this pasuk, I'm saying, so what is this to me? I'm a Jewish guy or a Jewish woman, and why am I reading this? Because I'm not a Kohen and there is no Beit HaMikdash. So what's the message? Where am I in this pasuk? And that's the message. The message is, even when you're doing a mitzvah, you can't just do it in a perfunctory manner and say, I'm doing what I was told to do. I'm doing what I was told to do. You need to elevate yourself. So that's not always so easy, is it? So I'll give you an example that I know it applies to me, and maybe it applies to you too. So davening is a mitzvah. Okay, there's a machloket Ramban, when is it a mitzvah? Rav Moshe ben Maimon would say it's a mitzvah every day. Rav Moshe ben Nachman would say it's not a mitzvah every day. But at the end of the argument, that is the minhag of Yisrael for everybody to daven daily. It's a mitzvah. Okay. But it's a mitzvah that we can do in a lot of different ways. And for some of us, that's not an easy mitzvah. I just can't get into it. Okay, I daven, you know, tell us or not. I daven. I did the mitzvah. And the Torah is saying, okay, you did the mitzvah, but did you elevate yourself? Is there something different about you after having done this mitzvah? And it's not just true about davening, it's true about a lot of other mitzvot that we engage in. Do the mitzvot that we engage in somehow elevate us? Have they touched us? Have they changed us? You know, the old Hasidic idea is that every time you daven, you're not the same person you were yesterday, at least in a hopeful manner. Not one day older, one day wiser. We had a whole series of experiences today, some of them good, some of them neutral, some of them chas v'sholom, but they may have been very challenging. And so tomorrow's going to be a new day, but everything that happened to you today has changed a little bit who you are. So each time you're going to be davening a new day, you're a slightly different individual. But are you open to that idea? Are you open to being reflective? Are you open to thinking about how the mitzvah ought to have, should have helped you raise yourself up? Yes, religious performance does matter. That's what mitzvot are. But we also need to keep pushing ourselves up to be that flame. It's not easy. But one of the things I think you've heard me say a lot is Judaism has always believed in people's potential. And nobody can ever reach their potential. The minute you reach your potential, you're no longer alive. Life means growth. That's, by the way, what is the name of the first man who was ever created? His name, as you know, is, in Hebrew, it's Adam. In English, it's Adam. But Adam comes from what word? It comes from the word Adamah. And one answer is, of course, it comes from Adamah, because what was the material God used to create Adam, or Adam? The earth of the ground, 100%. But what was the point of that? Like, God could create man from anything. He can create man from, peaches or other things. So why did he pick the ground? Because the ground is the quintessential soil for growth. It makes things grow. You want something to grow, you plant a seed in the ground. It becomes the most primordial and primary source of growth. And that's the message. We all need to grow. And maybe we grow in different ways for each of us, but that's the message. So the idea of the 3 steps up, is a message of, one, God has confidence in us and doesn't think that we sort of tap out at a while. No, as long as you're breathing, as long as you're alive, as long as you have a mind that's functioning, you can grow. You can. You just have to want it badly. Not everybody wants it. We know that. Okay. So remember at the beginning of my comments at the beginning of the Shiur, we talked a little bit about the chronology. So the idea of the day of the inauguration, which is the end of last week's Parsha, is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Everybody with me? Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now, interestingly enough, when we began Sefer B'Midbar, already this is a couple of Parshas ago, just want to read for you something that we started with. The Ber Hashem Moshe, the Midbar, I'm now beginning the reading from the beginning of Sefer Midbar. The Ber Hashem Moshe, Bim Midbar Sinai Bo Moed. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert, in Ol Moed. And here now the date is given. B'echad lachodesh hasheni, b'shana hasheni, let's say Tamei Eretz Mitzrayim Lemor. So this conversation that is recorded at the very beginning of Sefer Midbar is taking place on Rosh Chodesh of the second month of the year after they left. So they left in Nisan, and this is the second month. So it's now Nisan to Nisan, and this conversation is taking place on Rosh Chodesh Iyar. That's how this book begins, on Rosh Chodesh Iyar. Okay, I get it. Bimidbar is talking about Rosh Chodesh Iyar. But in Sefer, in our Parsha, in the ninth parak, Torah says something very interesting. I'm going to read this verse. I'm turning now to the beginning of Parak Tet. Hebrew, then English. V'yedaber Hashem Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'shana hashenit, let's say Tamei Eretz Mitzrayim b'chodesh harishon lemor. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the wilderness of Sinai in the second year from their exodus in the land of Egypt, in the first month. And then in this section, Hashem begins to outline all the laws of Pesach. Okay, just be clear. Pesach and Mitzrayim, everybody's sitting around and scared in their homes. Makat Bechorot, that's the night of Pesach. This is now Rosh Chodesh Nisan, a year later. And Hashem, in Parak Tet of our Parsha, is telling Moshe, I want you to remind the Jewish people that it's now coming up to the 14th day, 15th day of Nisan, the year anniversary of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And I want to remind all of you that you have to do Pesach. And just give everybody a refresher course on Pesach. That's Parak Tet. Okay, so let's just stop a second and think. Sefer B'midbar began with Hashem speaking to Bnei Israel on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the month after Nisan. 9 chapters later, the Torah tells us that Hashem tells Moshe on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, a month earlier, to talk about getting ready for Pesach. What's the obvious question? The obvious question is, how come this isn't in chronological order? Why doesn't Sefer B'midbar begin with Rosh Chodesh Nisan and do everything that needed to be done in Chodesh Nisan? At the conclusion of that, you can then tell me about the message that Hashem gave Moshe in the beginning of Sefer B'midbar and then Rosh Chodesh Iyar. It's out of order. Iyar comes after Nisan. Nisan comes before Iyar. So why did the Torah do that? So in our Parsha, that question does not escape Rashi and other Meforshim's glance. And so I want you to listen to Rashi's explanation. Now, I'm again reading now from Sefer B'midbar, Parsha Be'halot, our Parsha, chapter 9. V'lama lo patach. So why did Sefer B'midbar not begin with the topic here in the 9th chapter, which is the topic of reminding everybody about the Korban Pesach? Mipnei shehu genutan shel Yisrael. And Rashi says, quoting an earlier source, a Tanaitic source, in a work called the Sifrei, Midrash Halakha. The Chachamim say, well, Moshe deliberately did not want to start Sefer B'midbar with this. Why? Because it's shameful. It's humiliating. It's embarrassing, in fact. It's embarrassing. God is telling you to get ready for Pesach. That's not embarrassing. That would make sense. And Rashi says, that's not the embarrassing part. The embarrassing part is that of the 40 years that Bnei Israel were in the desert, they only celebrated one Pesach. And this is what's referred to in our Parsha, Parak Tet of Parsha Be'halot. One Pesach in 40 years. What? Pesach was supposed to be observed every year. So I get why Hashem is reminding them here, but what happened? Rashi and the Chachamim were saying, we're not starting Sefer B'midbar with this. We're tucking it away in Parak Tet in chapter 9. Why? Because I don't want to draw so much attention. I don't want it to be the marquee subject in the opening of Sefer B'midbar. It's going to draw too much attention, and people are going to look at it and they're going to say, wow, this is embarrassing. What's the embarrassment? What's embarrassment is this, is that 8 weeks after this happened, Moshe sent the Miraglim. 8 weeks. Moshe sent the Miraglim to Israel. Moshe was convinced that they were days away from entering the land. Days away. So he sent them Miraglim. We know that that story is going to come up in a little while too, but it's not this week's story. And what happened? It all just fell apart. It all fell apart. And instead of just being days away from entering the land in the most glorious period of Jewish history, probably our lives would not be the lives we have now if the Miraglim story didn't happen. If the Jewish people, Bnei Israel, had entered Eretz Israel like they were intended to, as soon as they should have, I bet that all of Jewish history would have unfolded in a completely different way. Maybe we wouldn't be sitting here, we wouldn't be having a Zoom Shiur, we would have been born elsewhere, the whole world would be different. But it didn't happen. What happened was the Miraglim came, they just upended everything, the people were so convinced not to go, they said, we don't want to go, and Hashem said, and that's the case, all of you are dying in the desert, there is no Israel for the next generation, only your kids are going to get to go there. That's shameful. Oh my gosh. So why is it that they didn't have Pesach for 40 years? I haven't explained that. Well, I'll tell you why. Because once Hashem assigned them a period of you're going to be in the desert, and you're not, and we know how the whole travel order happened. They didn't know when they're traveling. They didn't know when they're supposed to make camp. That would be a sign from God. They could have spent a little time in a place. They could spend a lot of time in a place. They had no idea what God's plan was when they made camp. How long was the camp going to be set up for? How quickly did they have to take it down? I'm mentioning that because that plays a huge role in another mitzvah called Brit Milah. When you don't know whether or not you have time to let a child recover from the bris, traveling becomes a potential source of danger, and children could die, especially under the circumstances in the desert. So, because they were destined to be in the bar for 40 years, they didn't do Brit Milah for 40 years. Not just Pesach, but Brit Milah. But you probably remembered from learning about Pesach that there's a connection between eating the Korban Pesach and having a Brit Milah. If you were a Jewish man and didn't have a Brit Milah, you couldn't eat the Korban Pesach. Well, none of the babies born in the desert could eat the Korban Pesach. And since there was a whole group of people born couldn't eat the Korban Pesach, nobody was allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. So the only Korban Pesach that the Jewish people ate while 40 years in the desert is mentioned here in chapter 9. That, says the Chachamim and Rashi quotes, that's embarrassing. They didn't have the faith in God to go into Israel. And as a result of that, they forfeited the opportunity to Pesach. We're not starting Sefer B'Midbar with that. We're tucking this away. So let Sefer B'Midbar begin with Chodesh Iyar, second month. And then 9 chapters later, we'll go back and we'll talk about what happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan a month ago. We're not gonna make that a headliner in lights. Okay. So I just want to unpack this with you and share an idea that I had. So according to this Rashi, the reason not putting this story as the opening story is in Hebrew, Mipnei Gilutan Shel Yisrael, because of the shame, of the humiliation that would come to the Jewish nation if it would get so much attention. This was a shameful part of our past. I want to go back to Pesach. It's not so long ago that we don't remember. So we all sat around the table wherever we were, and we had a Seder. And we had a book that we read from. It's the most scripted book ever. It's called the Haggadah. And the Mishnah in Masechet Pesachim, the 10th parak, actually details how we're supposed to tell the story. There's an order to the story. And here's how the Chachamim in Masechet Pesachim, 10th parak, how the Chachamim tell us the story should be told. So here's 4 words. Matchil begenut u'mesayem b'shvach. The story, as it unfolds and as it's now put together in our Haggadah, has to begin with a shameful part of our past. Now, what's the shameful part of our past? There's a machloket. Rab says it begins with Avadim Hayinu, talking about us being slaves. You know, we like to think of ourselves as important, noble people. but we actually were slaves. We were slaves in Egypt. We were beaten. We were degraded. We were humiliated. We dropped to the 49th level of impurity. That's not a particularly praiseworthy period of our history, but that's how we're going to start with, because we know how the story ends. It ends with something praiseworthy, God's praise, the Jewish people's praise. That's what Rav says. Shmuel says, no, I think the story even has to go further back than what happened in Mitzrayim. How far back does it go? Shmuel says it should go back to Avram Avinu, should go back to Terach, should go back that we were descendants of idolaters, people who didn't have a clue about God, nothing. We were idol worshippers. That's also not to put in a resume and to write home about. Oh, look, my grandfather was an idol worshipper. Oh, you have such yichus. That's not something we're going to shout about. So, be that as it may, however, one thing is absolutely clear. And this is a rule in the Mishnah, that every Seder around the world, every person who's observing Pesach on the Seder the way they're supposed to, matchil b'genut u'mesayem b'shvach. You begin with the shameful part of our history, and you work toward the conclusion, which is going to be glorious, majestic, and filled with honor. So are you hearing the question as I'm developing it? When it comes to Pesach and the Seder table, we know how the story should be told. How should it be told? We begin with the shameful part. Sefer B'midbar, no, we're not starting with the shameful part. We can't do that. Can't start about that. Can't start about that Pesach. We'll tell the story, but it has to be tucked away. Why? Because this is too humiliating to the Jewish people. Well, being idolaters in Pesach Seder is not humiliating. Being descendants of slaves doesn't have a little bit of a black stain to it. So why do we have these two contradictory sort of ideas, tendencies? Haggadah, you're okay to start with the Genut, the shameful part, but not Sefer B'midbar. So this is what I think. This is my idea. The difference between Haggadah and Sefer B'midbar is this. Haggadah was written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after the story. The Mishnah was written in the 2nd century, 1,000 years after it happened. So the Chachamim are writing with this distance, with this certain level of dispassionate intellectual ability to understand the messages of Dut and Mitzrayim. And it was okay. It was okay to start with that because we can explain it away. But Sefer B'midbar is written in real time. It's not written years and years and years, centuries after it happened. Moshe is writing these as the stories transpire. And at the end of 40 years, he's going to give them the book that he compiled and said, this is what we just did for the last 40 years. This is current history. This is not ancient history. This is about us. And you can't start Sefer B'midbar with something that is so demoralized. You can't start Sefer B'midbar with the story about people who faced a glorious opportunity and blew it. They just brushed it away. They let their shortcomings, they let their fears, they let all of the things that made them smaller take hold of them. And that's not something that we can tolerate. And in a certain way, again, I'm going back to a point that I've said multiple times. So what does this have to do with me? This is Jews in the desert, right? That desert's gone. I'm reading it. Baruch Hashem, I'm not in the desert. Baruch Hashem, I wasn't amongst those who poo-poo the role of Israel. I'm a Zionist. I marched with Israel on the 50,000 person march. I give donations. That's not me. That was them. But that, I don't think, is the point. The point that I'm taking out of this and why you couldn't start Sefer B'midbar, Yipnei Genutan Shel Yisrael, is we are writing a story right now. Everybody writes a story every year of their life. But we're living in extraordinary times, and we are writing a story. I don't know how it's going to end up, but we have to be aware of the narrative that we are contributing to. And I think the message for us is we cannot let ourselves make the same mistake that the Meraglim made. They rejected an opportunity. They didn't see the greatness that lay in front of them. They got scared. They moved away. I can't. It's too hard. It won't work. I can't. Excuses. Well, some of that applies to us too. We also are facing extraordinary challenges. And we need to be careful in the way, and I'm not just talking about just how each of us needs to respond, but we as a community, as a shul, as a tzibur, as a city, as a Jews around the world, as a nation? How do we respond to the challenges that we have? When we ought to have responded in a manner that would have brought us glory, we took a step back. So I'm not saying what the step forward is for all of us. And maybe some of you have your own thoughts about what that ought to be. But I am saying this, whether we want to think about it or not, we are writing a story. And one of the things that I've learned since I've transitioned from my former job, which, as you know, was at a school in Tivot, to working at Aish, is I have come to understand one of the principal core messages of the Aish ethos. And as I see it and are more connected to it, it's resonating. And what was it? Well, as you know, Aish Torah was the brainchild of Noah Weinberg, of blessed memory, who pushed this idea of Aish for Aish Torah as a movement. But one of the key principles of this movement is the Jews are responsible for each other. Jews are responsible for each other. We cannot just simply sit back and say, okay, it's playing out in somebody else's backyard, not in mine. Jews need to be responsible for each other. And that can mean so many things in different ways. But we are writing a story. And one of the things that we need to write in our story is how we understand our mutual responsibility. And so this time that we live in, where there's so much happening, and some of it makes our heads spin. It's happening so quickly. But one of the things that is happening, and I've spoken about this and you've heard me say it, is that more than any other time in the recent past, there is a willingness of Jews who have never been connected to Torah or Judaism or Yiddishkeit to be open to hearing those things. And I'm not saying that everybody now has to go and proselytize, but I am saying as a nation that feels responsible for Jews, I think we have to stop thinking, okay, so what role do I play? What's my part? And that's why I think it was worthwhile thinking about Mipnei Gnutan Shel Yisrael. Okay, I have about 10 minutes left. I want to share one more Dvar Torah with you, which is about the thing that we started with. That's the 7 books in Sefer Bamidbar. So as I mentioned before, one of those books is a very short book, according to this opinion in the Gemara. So what's the book? The book is two psukim. That's it. It's just 2 psukim. Vayim bin Zoah ha'aron vayomer Moshe Kuma Hashem v'yafutzu oivecha v'yinusu misanecha mipanecha uv'nocho yomar shuv Hashem rivot alfei Yisrael. But the part that I wanted to spend a couple minutes with you now, before this year is over, is those 2 nonim, those 2 norms. One in the beginning of his 2 psukim, and one. So they're placed there on purpose. It's not a mistake. It's not like the sofer's hand skipped or jumped and, oh my God, look, it came out to be nun. There's a reason for this. So let's just try to understand what this reason is. There's an interesting collection of midrashim, and the author of this collection of midrashim, in his introductory comments, quotes a midrash which nobody has been able to find in the vast collection of midrashic literature, but he quotes it, so I assume that it existed in some collection that nobody else saw. So he says that 3 rabbis were together, and the question was raised to them, what is the most important pasuk in the Torah? That's a challenging question. So I want to make this short and tell you the 3 verses that people came up with. So one rabbi said, I think the most important verse in the Torah is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Who's going to argue with that? That's important. It's the basic statement of faith of the Jewish people. Of course it's important. It might even be the most important. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem. How many Jews live by and say it every day before they go to bed? How many Jews live only and lost their lives by declaring the faith of Hashem? But the other Tana said, I have a different verse. I don't think so. For me, it's V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the source of all Torah. Even the Gemara tells us that when the non-Jew went to Hillel and say, teach me the entire Torah, was standing on one leg, Shammai was really ticked off with him and he didn't take him seriously because he thought that the non-Jew was taking him not seriously. What, the entire beauty of Torah is still in one verse, in one mitzvah? You can't do that. It's foolish. But Hillel somehow felt differently. He said, okay, I will tell you the entire Torah in one leg. This is what he said, first in Aramaic. Which means what is hateful unto you, don't do to somebody else. Which is just the flip side of love your neighbor like yourself. Do to somebody what you want done to you. Don't do to somebody what you don't want done to you. And so Hill says that's the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. That's it. But that's the ikr of the Torah is those words. Three words is the entire Torah. Then comes the last Tana and says, well, I really appreciate Shema Yisrael. I think the Haftarah is great, but I have a different pasuk, which is it. The keves achad baboker, the keves hasheni bein harabayim. He says, yeah, it's a section in Korbanot talking about the daily sacrifice called the Korban Tamid, which had to be brought every day. One keves, one sheep had to be brought in the morning, and one had to be brought in the afternoon. That pasuk, he says, is the most important pasuk in the Torah. What? Compare that to Shema Yisrael, compare that to V'havla Recha Kamocha. It sounds like it's really so base, it's so non-inspirational. So what was the thinking behind that? So the explanation is the thinking behind that is this. Every day they had to bring the Korban to me. Every day, at the same time. Every single day, meeting all the requirements. 365 days of the year, according to solar count, 354, the lunar count, but every day. So that pasuk's message is consistency. That's the secret of Jewish life. That's the secret of Jewish existence throughout the ages. We were consistent. We didn't fold. We didn't give up. We didn't get overwhelmed by the huge waves of modern culture and ancient anti-Semitic attempts to get rid of us. We stood our ground. We were consistent and persistent in what we believed to be true. And we did what we had to do. We paid a price. But we did what we had to do as we had to do it, and that's why we're here, and other civilizations are not. So if you ask me what's the most important pasuk, this is the pasuk, this is the key to Jewish existence, consistency. I'm offering that as a framework of what? So these two verses are supposed to be verses that would have been the verses that led the Jewish people into the land of Israel. Why is this a chumash unto itself? Everything that came before it was hopeful. Everything that came before it was good. We're getting ready. We're taking a census. We're lighting the menorah. We reminded ourselves about Pesach. We're getting ready to build a Mishkan. Everything between the first parak and the 10th parak, where this is that, is getting ready to go into the land of Israel and then writing the amazing, majestic story of Israel's entry into the land of Israel and its glorious future. Oh, but everything that comes after it is a disaster. It's the non-consistency. It's forgetting what we're supposed to be doing. It's the complaining. It's the rejection of Israel. It's a whole different part. And so the idea that we have 3 books is based on the idea that these represent different departures. The first part is hopeful. Then the idea we're just about to enter, and then the disaster. It's when we forget the consistency message that things turn bad, like the end of Sefer Bamidbar. But what about the Nun? What is that about the Nun? So let me just remind you a little bit about a Nun. So I know what the Nun is. It's that letter in the alphabet. It has the Nun version that you write in the middle of a letter. It has the Nun version at the end of a letter. But here's something about Nun that maybe we haven't spent enough time talking about. The Nun has this very specific role and meaning. The Nun has a specific meaning. I will give you an example. Lisachek means to play. So a person who plays in Hebrew is misachek. But there's a Hebrew word called sachkan. What does sachkan mean? An actor. 1 second. Keep that in mind. The Nun changes the meaning from somebody who plays to somebody who's an actor. And what's the difference between a misachek and a sachkan? The nun makes that person do this on a consistent basis. It's not episodic. It's not just about playing a role once or twice. This is what you do. You take on roles. I'll give you another example. And you probably know many other examples like this. A person could be compassionate. In fact, this is part of the bracha that we recite just before reading Kriyat Shema in the morning. Avat Olam or Rabbi, whichever version, Yusuf Sfarad, Yusuf Ashkenaz. The Torah calls Hashem a merachem. What is a merachem? A merachem is somebody who is compassionate, who acts compassionately. Merachem. But Hashem is called not just merachem, he's called rachaman. It's the same shorish. So what's the difference between a merachem and a rachaman? A rachaman is a person who always acts compassionately. It's not episodic. It's who he is. It's part of their personality. It's part of her makeup. She's a rachmanit or a rachaman. It means that's what they're doing. And a person can be a soleach. And it's so interesting that on Yom Kippur, I changed the language and I call Hashem a solchan u'machalan l'shivtei Yisrael. Hashem is called a solchan. What does solchan mean? It doesn't say he's a soleach. It's a solchan. Soleach means he forgives. I get it. But what's a salchan? You're full of forgiveness. That's the only way you can be. A person who learns Torah, who lomei. But what's a lamdan? A person whose life is dedicated. He breathes, she breathes and lives Torah all the time. Studying fills their life. It's not episodic. The nun changes something from episodic to constant. Now let's go back and see, why was the nun chosen to be the letters that bracketed these two psukim? Vayihi b'nso ha'aron. Let us go forward with Torah. Let us follow Hashem. Hashem, uvnucho yomar shuva Hashem, revifat Hashem. You reside, Hashem, among the myriad. Be part of who we are. Reside amongst us. That's what we want, not just episodically. We want it forever. We want that persistence. And that's why the nun was chosen, because the nun as a letter is the letter that details the notion of persistence, of ongoing continuity about something. And so when these two psukim were written, they were bracketed by the nunim as a way of showing just how deeply held that feeling was, that this could be something that would go on and on and on with no end. Unfortunately, the story ended in a manner that neither Moshe was happy with. Hashem, I don't think, was happy with it. And maybe us in retrospect, maybe we are happy with it, maybe not. But had it ended the way Hashem had planned it, the plan A version, then things would have been different. Maybe the plan B version is the version that we needed for ourselves to become who we are today. But the nun is that message of continuation. So that brings us to the end of the shiur. I'm going to unmute everybody. Love to hear your thoughts as we have an opportunity perhaps to talk a little bit.
Powerful, very powerful. Thank you.
Oh, was that good? Was that okay?
It was excellent, excellent, fascinating, captivating, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon, oh, you got on. Hooray. Good for you. Thank you, Sharon. I'm glad that you made it. Anybody else have some thoughts, comments? Hi, Eva. Hi, Andrew. Marty, good to see you. The beans are here. Excellent.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Selma. I appreciate that. Always do. I appreciate everybody coming. It means a lot. Jonathan, thank you. Well, if you're a quiet crowd tonight, that's okay. That's okay. It's okay to be quiet. I appreciate that. You learn a lot. I've always said Hashem gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should listen twice as much as we speak. So listening is a good thing. Silver's in Calgary. Hello. Hello. So I wish everybody a good week, a week of bracha, a week of simcha, a week of good news from Israel, a week of peace. All the hostages should be home. They should all have a full shlema. Hashem should show his love to all of us and give us a future that we can embrace without fear, without our children having to put on combat uniforms to fight. So here at Son, may this be a week that we hear of the coming of the Mashiach, and our Shiur next week, which will be the final one before the summer, won't be in Toronto. Halavai, we could be sharing it together in Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh.
Amen.
Amen.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Have a
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you. Bye bye.